Ideologies are stronger than individuals. Let me say that again. Ideologies are stronger than individuals. It is not a matter of identifying evil people. It is a matter of grasping the evil ideologies that animate such people. Today, we will attempt to understand the evilest and vilest of all ideologies, the evil and vile ideology of National Socialism. My name is Joseph Suglia, Suglia, and this is a video essay entitled The Evil Ideology of the National Socialists. How could an ideology as evil as National Socialism exist? And how could it have been embraced and endorsed by such cultured, educated people as the Germans of the early 20th century? Where did National Socialism come from? How is it possible that anyone sane ever believed this evil nonsense? The horrors of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and the other extermination camps resulted in an immense heap of dead bodies. It is important to think historically. Germany was dominated by the French in the early 19th century. Napoleon and his army crushed the Prussian and the Austrian armies in 1806 and founded a French satellite alliance known as the Confederation of the Rhine. Many Germans were antipathetic to the French occupation of Germany. Let me be absolutely explicit. The French and the Germans have never had amicable relations. They have always been blood enemies. They have always been blood enemies. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 might have ended the First World War, but didn't it ignite the Second? Didn't the Treaty of Versailles ignite the Second World War, World War II? Germany was forced to pay vindictive economic reparations to the Allies, and its army was severely reduced to 100,000 volunteers. Its naval force was retrenched. Germany's naval force was retrenched. The German government could not pay what was demanded of him. The German government could not pay what was demanded of it, I should say. This is why Belgian and French troops occupied the Ruhr region, that is spelled R-U-H-R, the Ruhr region. In 1923, this is the most densely populated area of Germany, the industrial heartland of Germany. And why did the Belgian and French troops occupy the Ruhr? To seize timber and coal when Germany fell behind on its payments. The Germans were reft of dignity, reft of consolation, reft of their self-sufficiency, reft of their national independence. The Germans were colonized by the French yet again. There was a terrible hatred of the French, both in the early 19th century and also in the 1920s. So that's the early 1800s and also in the 1920s. Now, one might call this Francophobia, but it really wasn't an unreasoned fear, was it? It was more of a hatred. The French were associated with the Jews, and the Jews were associated with the French. Why? Because Napoleon liberated the Jews. Napoleon, by the way, is one who said, allegedly, the statement is ascribed to Napoleon. For the French who are Jewish, everything. For Jews who are French, nothing. In the early 19th century, so this is the early 1800s, Napoleon abolished the ghettos, the formal segregation of the Jews. Regions of Germany, such as the Rhineland, much of Western Germany, etc., were placed under the regnancy of the French, which led to the dismantlement of the ghettos. Jews were liberated and granted civic rights by Napoleon and the other French occupants of Germany. So, to be clear, Napoleon granted civic rights to French Jews and other French occupants of Germany, and German Jews as well. In the minds of many Germans, there was a close connection, a close association between Jews and liberalism. So, in the minds of many Germans, in the minds of too many Germans, there was a close connection between Judaism and liberalism. And the liberalism of the 19th century was associated with Napoleon's occupation of Germany in the early 19th century. So liberalism was associated with Napoleon and with Napoleon's occupation, his colonization of Germany in the early 19th century. So Napoleon, once more, granted the Jews rights, but Jews were still not permitted to hold professorial chairs or to be officers in the army, even then. The Jews were not really emancipated until 1918 with the fall of the Wilhelmine monarchy. That is the monarchy of Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Weimar Republic began after Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated his monarchical position. So the Weimar Republic, Democratic Republic of Weimar, began after the monarchy ended with the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Well, this explains a great deal. This explains, for instance, why the Nazis hated the Weimar Democratic Republic. This explains why the Nazis hated the Social Democrats. Jews were granted rights. And again, the Jews were associated with the French. The German currency in 1923 was known as the Papiermark. Now you can see that on the screen. That is the Papiermark. It's a digital copy, a digital facsimile of the Papiermark. And in 1923, the Papiermark was devalued to the point of worthlessness. In 1923, 4.2 trillion Papiermark was equivalent to $1 American. So 4 trillion banknotes, 4.2 trillion Papiermark was equivalent to $1 American in 1923. So there were at least two immediate factors that forcefully propelled the ascendancy of National Socialism, right? There are two immediate factors that forcefully propelled the ascendancy of the Nazi movement, the Nazi Party, right? The first is the devaluation of German currency, again, known as the Papiermark. And secondly, the billeting of French troops, the quartering of French troops in the most populous and industrialized region of Germany, the Ruhr, again, the industrialized heartland of Germany, was colonized by French and Belgian troops, especially by the French soldiers. But the roots of National Socialism run much deeper. The roots of the Nazi ideology run much, much deeper. And that is the entire point of this video essay, to illuminate the roots of the Nazi movement, the Nazi ideology, the ideology of National Socialism. Where did the Nazis learn to exclude the Jews, the Gypsies, and all foreigners from the German nation, and ultimately to slaughter them? Where did the Nazis learn this? The answer is simple. In school. They learned it in school. The young men who joined the Nazi Party were taught by the students of the folkish ideology. The teachers of the Nazis were extreme folkish ideologues. And now my thesis has finally gemmed. And now my thesis has finally gemmed. The Nazis cannibalized educationalists from their own country who were active 1 century earlier. One might say that the Germans endo-cannibalized themselves, that they auto-vampirized themselves. The most prominent figures of German nationalism in the German educational system of the early 19th century, okay, so this is the early 1800s, taught those who would teach the Nazis. I'm not saying that they taught the Nazis. I'm saying that they taught those who would teach the Nazis. Before the National Socialist German Workers' Party germinated from the German Workers' Party. These were the two nationalists who planted the seeds that would germinate into the climactic Nazi ideology. One was the German father of gymnastics. The other was a German transcendental, reflective, idealist philosopher. The first was named Father Jan, and that is spelled Jahn. And the second was Johann Gottlieb Fichte, spelled Fichte. The first was Father Jan. He is known as the father of gymnastics in Germany. And the second is Fichte, the German transcendental, reflective, idealist philosopher. The intellectual forerunner of National Socialism is not Nietzsche. And I'm so sick of people blaming Nietzsche. It's anachronistic. It's utterly anachronistic and it's very silly. Well, it's perniciously silly. Silly and pernicious. No, the forerunners of National Socialism are Johann Gottlieb Fichte and Father Jan. That is Father Jan on the screen. That is Father Jan on the screen. So Father Jan and Fichte were German nationalists. They were folkish ideologues who were active in the very early 19th century when Germans were struggling to assert themselves spiritually against the French. They acted as a kind of megaphone for the anti-French sentiment of the time. In the early 19th century, Germany was attacked, depredated, despoiled by foreign powers, particularly by the French army led by Napoleon. And students looked for German unity. They saw Father Jan as the leader of German unity when the German states were still very much disunited. And this is something I really don't have the time to talk about now, perhaps in a future video essay. But back then, Germany, before Bismarck unified the German states, Germany really was a cluster. It was a constellation of small states. It's very difficult to translate this from the German, but the German word is Kleinstaaterei, which sometimes is translated somewhat roughly as small statehood. I can't really talk about that now. At the Wartburg Festival. Now, this is spelled Wartburg. At the Wartburg Fest. At the Wartburg Festival. Books were burned. Books written by liberal-minded authors, non-German authors, allegedly un-German authors. This took place on the 18th of October, 1817, at the Wartburg Castle in Eisenach. Father Jan was present at this event. He did not lead the event, but he did inspirit the event. "500 professors and students gathered to give speeches and to listen to speeches, calling for a German national revivification and rejuvenation against the French despoilers and against the French spoliators." I'm not sure how much of that was recorded, so I will read this again. I will say this again. At the Wartburg Festival, books were burned. Books written by liberal-minded authors, non-German authors, allegedly un-German authors. This took place on the 18th of October, 1817, at the Wartburg Castle in Eisenach. That is spelled Eisenach. Father Jan was present at this event. He did not lead the event, but he did inspirit the event. 500 professors and students gathered to give speeches and to listen to speeches, calling for a German national revivification and rejuvenation against the French despoilers and spoliators. I hope that was recorded. The festival commemorated Martin Luther's nailing of the 95 Theses to the church door, which instigated the Protestant Reformation. Father Ludwig Jahn was known as Turnvater Jahn, the father of gymnastics in Germany. He was unamenable to Jewish emancipation, putting it mildly. He was unamenable to Jewish liberation, to Jewish emancipation. Indeed, he excluded the Jews from his ideal of the German nation. The Jews were associated in his writings with the French, which again comes from the fact that the French emancipated the Jews in Germany. But the point is that Father Jan represented the Jews as degradative, corruptive, corrosive to the German nation. In his 1810 book, Deutsches Volkstum, which is very difficult to translate. It's very difficult to translate that title. I suppose I can translate it as the German folk character or German folk character. So in his 1810 book, German folk character, Deutsches Volkstum, Jan defines folkishness in the following terms. I will read this in German and then I will translate it or attempt to translate it into English. Nix ist ein Stadt ohne ein Volk, ein seelenloses Kunstwerk. Nix ist ein Volk ohne Stadt, ein leibloser, luftiger Schemen, wie die weltflüchtigen Zigeuner und Juden. Now in English, I will do my best to translate this. Nothing is a state without a people. Or even better, no. Nothing is a state without a folk. Nothing is a state without a folk. A soulless artifice. Nothing is a folk without a state. A bodiless, airy phantom, like the wandering gypsies and Jews. End of quotation. The following terrifying statement is ascribed to Father Jan. Hass alles Fremden ist des Deutschen Pflicht. Hatred of all foreigners is the German's duty. End of quotation. That is definitely not me. That is definitely not me. That was Father Jan. So let me move ahead 116 years into the future perfect. Into the future perfect. Let me now discuss the book burning of 1933, what I call the immolation, or perhaps I should call it the immolations. In 1930s Germany, the press was Nazified, and books that were regarded as inconducive to Nazism were burned in terrible bonfires. Books that were regarded as inconducive to Nazism were burned in terrible bonfires by students. This is exactly what happened 116 years before at the Wartburg Castle. What happened in 1933 is exactly correlatable to what happened in 1817. On May 10th, 1933, students, primarily organized by the German Student Union, the Deutsche Studentenschaft, burned thousands of books in coordinated events across Germany. The most famous burning took place at Obenplatz in Berlin. Today it's called Bebelplatz. A torch-lit brigade of thousands of students incinerated an entire library. Books by Schnitzler and Proust, among so many others, were immolated in the Nazi bonfire. 10 May 1933. Under the tutelage of Goebbels, Goebbels, Goebbels. The burnings were initiated by students, but strongly supported and encouraged by Nazi officials. Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, gave a speech at the Berlin event, praising the action. Why were the books burned? The students targeted works they considered un-German, undeutsch. The campaign was called Aktion wider den Deutschen. Nein. The campaign was called Aktion wider den undeutschen Geist. In English, action against the un-German spirit. Any books regarded as inconducive to the spirit and the goals of National Socialism were burned. In totalitarian dictatorates, all media that are regarded as inconducive to the regime are banned. In 1930s Germany, the only music that was permitted was classical music, though Mendelssohn's music was banned. Mendelssohn was Jewish. Also permitted were the noises of hack Nazi composers. Again, the press was Nazified. The press was Nazified. All forms of culture were nationalized. The only literature that was allowed to be produced and printed was Nazi literature, in quotation marks. Again, classical music was permitted, as long as the composer was not Jewish, as Mendelssohn was. Canonical theater and Nazified propagandistic plays were allowed. Hans Jost, that is spelled Johst, failed Nazi playwright, said that whenever he heard the word culture, he reached for his revolver. The only schools that were allowed to exist were the Adolf Hitler schools, and any parents who refused to enroll their children in the Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth, which numbered 7 million young people, were threatened with forced child-parent separation. The Democratic the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, bans any music that is not pre-approved by the state. Smiling on the 8th of July is prohibited. All 3 television channels in North Korea are nationalized, which is definitionally fascism, which is definitionally fascism. This is how totalitarian cults operate. Nothing from the outside is allowed in, and all truth comes from the dear leader. There is one republic, one book, one leader. Brainwashing only happens when external stimuli are cut off. The Führer against all forms of foreignness expanded. In 1940, a special search committee and a special search list was compounded by Himmler's Reich Security Main Office. In German, this was called die Sonderfahndungsliste. Die Sonderfahndungsliste. The Gestapo was to arrest 2,300 writers and scientists in Great Britain. The plan was to invade Great Britain, which of course never happened. Freud, who lived in Great Britain after the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, Virginia Woolf, H.G. Wells, Aldous Huxley, all of them would have been arrested if the Gestapo had infiltrated Great Britain. Thank God that never happened. The Gestapo was the Geheime Staatspolizei, which means the secret state police of the Nazi Party, led eventually by Heinrich Himmler under the auspices of the SS, the Schutzstaffel, which I guess you could translate as the protective squadron. Let me now turn to Fichte. Again, the name is spelled Fichte, the philosopher Fichte. I have no doubt that the following words inspirited Adolf Hitler. They are the words of Fichte in the 8th address of the Reden an die Deutsche Nation. In English, that would be addresses to the German nation. Remember, at the time that Fichte declaimed his address, German-speaking territories were under the control of Napoleon and his French armies. Napoleon had marshaled more than one military group, more than one army. Let it be remembered. Here are the words of Fichte from, again, Addresses to the German Nation. This is the 8th address to the German nation. What spirit is it that may take the helm, that has an undisputed right to command everyone who may be concerned, whether he wants to be or not, and to compel the objector to jeopardize everything, even his own life? Not the spirit of calm civic love for the Constitution and laws, but the blazing flame of the higher love of fatherland that embraces the nation as the vesture of the eternal, for which the noble man joyfully sacrifices himself, and the ignoble, who exists only for the sake of the former. So the ignoble person only exists for the sake of the noble man, should likewise sacrifice himself. The ignoble, in other words, should also sacrifice himself. The folkish ideologues' violently self-sacrificial love of the fatherland and their seething sacrificial hatred of all that is foreign was repeated almost word for word by the demoniacs of the Third Reich. There are entire tranches of Hitler's Mein Kampf that seem to paraphrase the venom of Jan and Fichte. The original title of Mein Kampf, incidentally, was 4.5 years of struggle against lies, stupidity, and cowardice. So the folkish ideology of the early 19th century is in perfect consonance with the Nazi ideology, the National Socialism of the early 20th century. The folkish worldviews of Father Jan, Fichte, and others crystallized into the evil ideology of the National Socialists, the evil ideology of the Nazis. Let me add a point that is not adventitious. Let me add a point that is not adventitious. The German boarding schools of the early 19th century the German boarding schools of the early 19th century excluded Jewish students, particularly those founded by Hermann Lietz. Now, his name is spelled Lietz, Hermann Lietz. The teachers of the Nazis were fraternity brothers in Germany's educational system, which was under the sway of Father Jan. Father Jan indoctrinated young German men into the folkish ideology, into a vehement hatred for Jews and for the French. Father Jan expounded an idealized image of German purity. Fichte was a professor at the University of Jena and at the University of Berlin. Obviously, not every German teacher was of the Nazis, not every German teacher of the Nazis was a former student of Jan or Fichte. But Jan and Fichte dominated the German educational system of the early 19th century. Again, the teachers of the Nazis were not students in the age of Jan and Fichte. No, no. The teachers of the Nazis were taught by students of Jan and Fichte. The concept of the folk, V-O-L-K, the concept of the folk, means that the Germans had a permanent essence that could never be stamped out, that could never be snuffed out, that could never be spoliated, that could never be scuttled. The concept of the folk suggested, and this is just my conception. These are not, I'm not quoting anyone. This is my own translation. Not my own translation, but this is my own interpretation. The concept of the folk suggested we Germans might chafe under Napoleon's rule. We might be enslaved by the French. but we have a folkish essence that will never die in the same way that our natural topography will never die. The murky, misty beauty of our Germanic forests. These will never die. This will never die. We are rooted in German land, and the French will never eradicate us. The French will never extirpate us. The French will never uproot us. We are, to coin a word, unuprootable. There actually is a word that means that in the English language, inextirpable. Does it make sense now why the Nazis burned French literature? Does it make sense now why they burned the great novels of Proust? Does it make sense now why they burned the great literature of one of my favorite writers, Schnitzler? The French were the outsiders, and so too were the Jewish people. Both Proust and Schnitzler were Jewish. Proust was French. Schnitzler was Austrian, but he was Jewish. The Jewish people were conceived as the people of the desert, according to German nationalists, and before them, according to the folkish ideologues. And there is no desert in Germany. Well, there is, there is a land mass that somewhat resembles a desert. It's like a quasi desert in Germany. It's called Lüneburger Heide, but it's not really a proper desert. The Jews were a metonym for the French, for Napoleon, again, partially liberated the Jews. German nationalists implied that Germanness is rootedness. They implied that Germanness is rootedness. And by extension, they implied that Judaism was rootlessness or unrootedness. Unrootedness. There's a perfect word for this, atopia. 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 There was, the German nationalists implied, an interpenetration of folk and cosmic nature, as if the German soul could never be displaced, as if the German soul could never be displaced, as if the German soul could never be exiled, as if the German soul could never be deracinated, as if the German soul could never be made to wander. As if to say that the German soul would never be uprooted by the French. The German theologians of race who asserted that Germans and Jews were incommensurable drew from a long tradition of anti-Judaism and a folkish ideology that held that the German essence transcended the city and transcended time. The folk was conceived as the German peoplehood, the extrasensory Germanic eternal substance, and the Jews, the proto-Nazis held, were alien to the Germanic eternal substance. In this, the folkish ideologues and the Nazis were concordant. They were in consonance on the subject of the folk, das Volk. The folkish movement in Germany solidified two contrasting types, the German type and the Jewish type. The German type was represented as soulful, rooted, grounded in German soil. The Jewish type was portrayed as soulless, rootless, groundless, as alien, as strange. The Jews, according to the German nationalists, belonged to a kind of atopia, to a kind of nowhere zone, to a nowhere scape. There was no place for the Jew in Germany, according to the folkish movement, and the movement of new romanticism that succeeded it. and to the Nazi ideology that succeeded that. As early as 1890, so 43 years before Hitler acceded to the Chancellery of Germany, a deranged German teacher named Hermann Alward, and this is how one spells his name, Ahlwardt. A deranged German teacher named Hermann Alward fantasized about a so-called Jewish world conspiracy and proposed that Jews should be distrained of their property. He proposed that Jews should be distrained of their property. He moved that their property should be expropriated and reappropriated by the German state. Alward also moved that Jews should be banished from all areas of public life and eventually deported from Germany. This is exactly what the National Socialists proposed and did over 40 years later. Alward's ravings are correlatable to the lunacies of Adolf Hitler. To be clear, this is exactly what the Nazis, this is exactly what the Nazis maliciously claimed over 40 years later. They maliciously painted the picture of the Jew as subhuman. All of this to say, all of this to suggest, National Socialism did not emerge from a void. National Socialism did not emerge from a void, but I hope that it returns to one. Thank you, everyone. My name is Joseph Sulia, Suglia, and this was a video essay entitled The Evil Ideology of the National Socialists. Thank you very much. This is Joseph Sulia signing out, signing off.